Welcome to Geek Philosophy, where it's all geek to me. One of the greatest tragedies in philosophy isn't when people disagree about values, it's when they stop having values altogether. For years, I thought and argued that America's political divide was fundamentally philosophical. I argued that Democrats and Republicans both wanted what was best for America. They simply disagreed about how to get there. Liberals tended to emphasize equality. Conservatives emphasized liberty. Liberals trusted collective solutions, and conservatives trusted individuals and private institutions. I honestly believed both sides were acting from sincere moral convictions. Today, I realize I was wrong. I no longer believe that's an adequate description of American politics. Not because Democrats suddenly became saints, far from it. Every political party is capable of hypocrisy. Every ideology has blind spots. Every movement can become tribal. But something fundamentally different has happened inside the modern MAGA movement. It has replaced virtue with loyalty. And that distinction is the difference between a republic and a cult of personality. Aristotle argued in the Nicomachean Ethics that virtue isn't about what you claim to believe. It's about habitual action. A courageous person doesn't occasionally act courageous. They consistently do. An honest person tells the truth, especially when lying would benefit them. Virtue is consistency. Character is what survives temptation. That's why Aristotle believed that actions, not slogans, reveal who we really are. And that's exactly where the modern conservative movement lost me. For decades, conservatives preached to us that character matters, family values matter, fiscal responsibility matters, the Constitution matters, state rights, law and order, they all matter, that no one is above the law, and government should be limited. They were presented as moral principles. Principles don't disappear when they're inconvenient. That's what makes them principles. And if the price of loyalty is your principles, you're considering the wrong side. If you're willing to pay that price, you are unprincipled. Yet, one by one, those principles were discarded whenever they conflicted with Donald Trump's interests. Character mattered until it didn't. Law and order mattered until it didn't. The Constitution mattered until it became inconvenient. Fiscal conservatism mattered until deficits exploded. The FBI was heroic until it investigated Trump. The Justice Department deserved respect until it prosecuted Trump. Election officials were trustworthy until they certified an election Trump lost. And yes, he lost that election. Suddenly, everyone became corrupt. Everyone became part of the deep state. Everyone became the enemy, and everyone except one man. That isn't conservatism. It's loyalty replacing principle. Immanuel Kant argued that morality depends upon consistency. His famous categorical imperative asks one simple question. Would this still be right if everyone did it? Or in today's political language, would you defend this exact behavior if the other party did it? Imagine for a moment Barack Obama had pressured election officials to find votes. Imagine Hillary Clinton refused to concede. Imagine Joe Biden suggested terminating parts of the Constitution to remain in office. Imagine any Democrat saying he alone could fix America. Would conservatives have applauded? Of course not. They would have called it tyranny, and they would have been right. If your standards change depending on whose name is attached to the action, then your standards aren't moral principles. They become team colors. Kant would call that irrational. Aristotle would call it vice. The rest of us, we just call it hypocrisy. George Orwell understood this decades ago. In 1984, truth isn't destroyed by force alone. It's destroyed by making loyalty more important than reality. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. That line isn't frightening because it's fiction. It's frightening because it describes a timeless political temptation. When objective facts become negotiable, power replaces truth. Doublethink becomes virtue. Contradiction becomes normal, and yesterday's enemies become today's allies. Yesterday's principles become today's inconveniences. Reality itself becomes partisan. And that's why V for Vendetta remains one of the greatest political films ever made. Not because it celebrates revolution, because it warns us about what happens when fear convinces citizens to surrender independent thought. Remember V's famous line?
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Notice, he doesn't say people should worship a leader. He doesn't say people should trust a party. He says governments should remain accountable. Accountability, not blind loyalty. Even Star Wars understood this. The Republic wasn't destroyed because everyone suddenly became evil. It collapsed because enough good people convinced themselves that extraordinary power was necessary for extraordinary times.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
The empire wasn't built by villains alone. It was built by ordinary people rationalizing one exception after another. History almost never announces dictatorship with dramatic music. It arrives wrapped in promises. Promises of security, promises of greatness, promises that only one man can fix everything. And then there's idiocracy. For years we laughed because it seemed absurd. Now it feels prophetic. Not because Americans became less intelligent, but because entertainment increasingly replaced deliberation. Politics became professional wrestling. Owning the other side became more important than solving problems. Being viral became more important than being right. Complexity became weakness. Certainty became strength. Experts became enemies, and ignorance became authenticity. We began rewarding confidence over competence. That isn't democracy functioning, it's democracy decaying. Hannah Arendt spent her life studying totalitarianism. One of her greatest insights was that authoritarianism doesn't merely demand obedience, it destroys the distinction between truth and falsehood. Eventually, people stop asking what is true. They only ask what helps my side. Once that happens, democracy becomes almost impossible because democracy requires a shared reality. You cannot compromise if reality itself becomes partisan. This isn't about Donald Trump alone. It's about the willingness of millions of Americans, including elected officials, to excuse behavior they once condemned because the person committing it wears the correct jersey. That's tribalism, not philosophy, not conservatism, not patriotism, tribalism. Now, let me be perfectly clear. Democrats are capable of hypocrisy, too. I've criticized cancel culture, I've criticized government overreach, I've criticized identity politics, and I've criticized ideological conformity on the left. I still do. But hypocrisy isn't measured by counting mistakes. It's measured by asking who abandoned more of their own stated principles. At this point, I don't think that's a close question. The evidence has become overwhelming, not because I hate conservatives, because I once agreed with many of them. I admired constitutional conservatism. I admired skepticism towards centralized power. I admired the emphasis on personal responsibility, and I admired their pride in America. That's precisely why watching those principles abandoned been so heartbreaking. There's an old philosophical saying, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do? That's where I am. I didn't leave my principles. My principles led me here. Because virtue demands consistency. Reason demands evidence. Truth demands humility. And patriotism demands that no citizen, no party, and certainly no president is ever placed above the ideals that make America worth loving in the first place. Because once loyalty becomes more important than truth, we've already lost the very thing we were trying to save. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Geek Philosophy. Remember, the greatest battles in history have never simply been between left and right. They've been between truth and tribalism, between virtue and power, between principle and personality, between wrong and right. Choose wisely. And until next time, don't just watch, think.